siguiente semestre. Bueno, pues buenos días. Vamos a comenzar con la transmisión. Y en un momento. Permítanme.
Okay, so I would like to first invite Juliette Kennedy to give us some opening remarks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to this interesting event. So I thought the opening remarks were invited to be somewhat personal to explain how we so I've been interested, I've been working in girl studies for, I guess, 30 years, something like that. I was still at tuning in the 1980s, where young, I think you are now.
Full time, do that.
Oh, full time, okay. So I was there in the late 1980s in the philosophy program. And there was quite a bit of anti-Hegelian feeling in the air, of the kind, great mathematician, great logician, terrible philosopher. Now, Noson was there as well, so you can disagree with me, but you were not in the philosophy department. I left the philosophy department, maybe even partly for that reason. People had this tendency to make self-judgment. So I became very fascinated by Gödel, part almost a kind of standoff between Harvard and that study as far as Gödel went. I mean, Takayuki came to visit Gödel one time at the Institute, and he was on his way up to Harvard, I presume to visit Klein. And Gödel said, why would you do that? So, and the feeling was reciprocated. I went to a talk by the late great fascinating person was very emphatic, not the mantra of the smoke was not be taken in charge. But, this is kind of absolute, this is kind of repressive and too long. So what was going on around me in regular school? So I soon realized that there were the medical papers were at Princeton, which is just an hour train ride from New York. So I started going to visit the archive, and of course, Gödel has published a little bit, so one can read. But I felt very compelled to go down to the archive and look at the actual material, look at writings and so on. So that was the beginning of my. The other book.
Perdón, voy a subir el audio.
¿Lo vas a reiniciar?
Part of
Oh,
my
de ahí nada
involvement
más.
was
Se oye mejor,
I
¿no?
met and became
Sí.
rather close to Stanley Tenenbaum.
Y si quieres, mira, ¿ves tu bocinita de la reproducción de YouTube? Ponla al máximo, si puedes, ahí en la parte inferior izquierda.
Very odd
Okay.
word to use. But
Izquierda, en la
Stanley,
izquierda.
he
Hay
never
una bocinita.
pretended to be an intimate friend of Gödel or anything like that,
Ahí
but
está.
he certainly talked a lot to Gödel, and he conveyed the sort of Gödel's philosophical position in a way that kind of really breathed life into the writings and gave a kind of way of reading the writings that would see them very much at odds with this kind of, Platonism, anti-Platonism discussion, which completely flattened Gödel's the nuances of his position and so on. So it was very interesting to talk to Stanley about Gödel's philosophical views. So that was my way in. And as far as the incompleteness theorems themselves, I just for the Cambridge Element series, I just wrote a book on this. They asked me to write a book on Gödel's theorems, and the Cambridge Element series are these 30,000 word books. So I said, well, I can't possibly write, the set theory and the, computable functionals of finite type and all this. Can't do that in 30,000 words, but I will write about the incompleteness theorems. So I just finished that, and that will be uploaded very soon. And I just finished it this summer, and I really learned a lot in the course of writing about the sort of technology around those theorems as of now. It's quite interesting where those theorems are at this point. So, but I'll be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. I hope I haven't gone on too long about myself.
No, that's very, very, very interesting. I would also like to now pass the microphone to Professor Noson, also for some opening remarks.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving me a chance to talk about this. Like Juliette said, I went to school with Juliette at I think we walked down the aisle together. I think we walked down the aisle together, getting our degree.
Oh, indeed we did. Yes, that aisle.
Sorry about that. Anyway, so I work in category theory and quantum computing and a little complexity theory. So there's this interesting result in category theory by Levier, and which he shows that a lot of self-referential paradoxes are all the same. And one of the main self-referential paradoxes, of course, is Gödel. And so I became extremely interested in that. Gödel himself says in a footnote on the paper, on his main paper, and I took it out just to say it. He says any epistemological. So Gödel's incompleteness theorem is based on I am unprovable, which is a variation of I am the liar. And Gödel himself says any epistemological antinomy could be used for a similar proof of the existence of undecidable propositions. So Gödel himself is pointing out the fact that all these different things are self-referential paradoxes. And so I took an interest in a lot of self-referential paradoxes, and I took an interest in Levier's paper of understanding how these all link together. And you can tell that they all link together because, let's say, Bertrand Russell wanted to explain Russell's paradox, and he describes it with the Barber paradox. So they're just different ways of seeing things. But Levier goes ahead and he formalizes it into a very, very simple a simple categorical theorem, and so, but it was category theory, and it was considered very hard. And so I wrote a paper in which I explained it, and then I explained Levier's theorem, and I show 19 instances of this paper. One of them being Gödel's incompleteness theorem, Tarski's theorem, et cetera, and I've been working on other things since then, but I've always kept this on the side. And so I'd like to just talk about some things that I have done with this on the side. So for one, I've extended it, and I recently coming out with a book also in Elements. It's called Theoretical Computer Science for the Working Category Theorist. And in it, I have a chapter in which we talk about a lot of this Levier's theorem instances in computability theory and complexity theory and stuff like that, and explaining it. Also, Gödel's incompleteness and all self-referential paradoxes, there's 3 points in it. They can all be done in some type of diagonalization theorem. They're all some type of self-reference, and they're all somehow related to fixed points or fixed point theorems. And so just to disentangle all those 3 concepts, self-reference, diagonalization, fixed point, I've been trying to make that much more orderly and understandable. I also got into a little bit in the philosophical thing and published some things about contradictions and stuff like that. Over the years, I've met a lot of seeming self-referential paradoxes and seeming diagonalization things and seeming fixed point theorems that don't fit into this Levier theorem. And so I've been looking at other methods and giving talks about other methods which category theory can, again, that's the purpose of category theory, unify these different things. So I've been looking at that. And just on the side, another thing that's been interesting me, and I've been in contact with a lot of people, is the relationship with physics. So the Heisenberg, the uncertainty principle, is also a limitation of knowledge. Okay, just like the Gödel's incompleteness theorem is stating a limitation of knowledge, and it's interesting to see how those are related. Now, just a short little story: John Wheeler, who was a great physicist, at some point felt that the uncertainty principle and the incompleteness theorem must be extremely related. And so he was in Princeton, and he walked into Gödel's office, and he asked Gödel, what's the relationship? And Gödel said, or is there a relationship? And Gödel said, no. And that was the end of the conversation. But there is some feeling that there is some type of connection there, and some people have written some papers on this, and also you can see it by yourself. There's a certain type of self-reference going on in quantum mechanics where the experiment depends on the experimenter, and so there is some type of connection, and it would be nice to somehow formalize that or make sense of it. Anyway, so that's what I've been. That's my relationship with Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and that's what I've been busy with.
Thank you so much. The first question we have also for all of you, because I think for me it's a really, really puzzling phenomenon, is how much of Gödel's incompleteness theorem is philosophy? How much of it is philosophy and how much of it is mathematics? For example, how much of it, how much of the proof of it reflects and is constrained by Gödel's specific philosophical views on mathematics and proof? And I want to again start by raising this question to Juliette.
Well, so the first thing one can say about that is that the very first proof of the incompleteness theorem that Gödel had, he did not publish because it relies on the notion of truth. So as he later told of Van Einhorn and Hal Wang and some other people, he said, of course, I realized in 1930 that provability is definable in, say, arithmetic, right? You can, you can express that in, let us say, arithmetic. He used a different system, whereas truth is not definable. It leads to paradoxes. So you immediately see that truth separates from proof. From proof right away. But he doesn't publish that. And then, of course, there's a side issue of truth as Tarski's theorem, but Gödel clearly had it. And it's very funny if you read his 1934 lectures in the Oxford Collected Works, when he comes to the fixed point theorem, he refers to, so not undefinability of truth, but the fixed point theorem. He says something like, I forget the exact formulation, but Tarski has also brought a great deal of attention to this recently, right? Instead of, and he actually credits Carnap with writing the thing down for the first time and proving it. But it's very interesting detail. In his 31 paper, he doesn't invoke the general fixed point theorem. He just does it, as was very characteristic of Gödel. He does it sort of on the spot as needed, and refrains from phrasing or even noticing, pointing out that there's a more general theorem here. And this was something one could be critical of Gödel for, and he in the work on constructibility and other things, hereditary ordinal definability, he didn't prove the general theorem. He just used. But anyway, so the first version of the theorem was simply truth separates from proof because one is definable and the other is not, and yet the provables are clearly a subset of the truth. So he goes to a great deal of trouble to eliminate semantic notions from the proof. And you can see that, for example, when he talks about the representability, or as we call it now, the strong representability of the primitive recursive functions, right? He doesn't invoke truth in the natural numbers, right? He invokes always a finite piece. So he goes to really, really great lengths to eliminate semantic notions. And, he explained to people, I did that because that was in the air at the time, right? I mean, there was a Vienna Circle, there was a very strong bias against, semantics and, truth and all that. And so he leaves it to Tarski to publish in 1934, The Undefinability of Truth. theorem, for example. So, so philosophical considerations really were weighed very heavily on his mind, clearly. Although it's very interesting that early on he made some strange statements. I mean, that Platonism, for example, could never satisfy a critical mind. He said that, and some other things. But by the 1940s, he's adopting truth as a primitive notion in his philosophical writings. There's no problem with it. He talks about the truth of axioms. You know, it's clearly a concept that he helps himself to fully.
Yeah.
So.
And why the evolution? Why the change?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think he knew, I mean, what Pfefferman has said about this is that he knew he had a very important theorem in the incompleteness theorems, and he didn't want there to be any objection or difficulty with it on the part of the Vienna Circle or the intuitionists or the finitists. You know, he wanted, and I think mathematically one always wants to prove a theorem with the fewest assumptions possible, and certainly the fewest metaphysical assumptions possible. So truth in N doesn't enter into the picture until theorem 10, when he's proving that these undecidable statements are arithmetic, actually, and he's using the beta function and so forth. So I think that's probably why.
Thank you so much. I would like to now turn the question to Graham. How philosophical is Gödel's theorem and its proof? How much is mathematics?
Okay, thanks, Axel. Let me just say that people who are listening may be puzzled why Axel didn't ask me to say a few preliminary words. And it's simply because before we started the recording, I said I'd be quite happy to go into the discussion. I didn't really have much to say by way of introduction. So he wasn't ignoring me. He was doing what I indicated. However, maybe in virtue of what I'm going to say, one or two words would be useful. I had my training as a logician in the UK. And I must confess that the attitude towards Gödel there was entirely different from the one of my American colleagues. Gödel was always regarded as profound. Okay, people may disagree about the profundity, but I never heard any logician, mathematical or philosophical dissing Gödel in those years. Okay, so one of my major interests in logic over the years has been on power consistency. This is power consistent logics, are logics which allow one to handle inconsistent information, inconsistent theories, without them collapsing into triviality. Contradictions don't spread because the principle of explosion fails. And that certainly wasn't in the air when I was a graduate student. It is now, I'm happy to say. And so I guess what's often interested me about Gödel's incompleteness theorems is the relevance of power-consistent logic on this. So, as everyone will know, I mean, Gödel assumed that the underlying logics of the theories he was dealing with was classical. And there's a question of what happens when you change the underlying logic, and specifically what happens when you change to an underlying power-consistent logic. And I guess most of the things I'm going to have to say today will be related to that issue. Okay, so let me now return to the question that you asked, Axel. Gödel's theorem, or Gödel's theorems, I think are one of the profoundest results in logic and mathematics in the 20th century. I don't think that's really in question. Wherein their profundity lies is a different matter, and that there is much less agreement on. So let me say a little bit more about those two things. Statements of Gödel's first incompleteness theorem come in many shapes and forms, of course. But at least in one very standard way of putting it, it's pretty logic neutral. The result does not depend very much on the underlying logic. So if you phrase Gödel's incompleteness theorem like this, any axiomatic theory that can represent all recursive functions is either inconsistent or incomplete. That result is pretty much logic neutral. It's not entirely logic neutral, but you don't need many assumptions about the underlying logic of the theory to get that out. You need a few quantifier inferences, but that's about all. So this is a result that is robust, pretty robust with respect to the underlying logic of the theory we're dealing with. So later on, I'm sure we're going to be discussing in more detail how the logic affects various issues of the mathematics, but let's leave that there for the moment and turn to the philosophical matter. The incompleteness theorems attract people like sort of sparkling objects attract jays or jackdaws. You'd be surprised how often I get papers from people saying, oh, let me tell you what Gödel's theorem really shows. And it's about God or the cosmos or reality or, I mean, most of these papers don't really cut the mustard. But no, there have been many, many claims that Gödel's theorem has profound philosophical consequences. And obviously, well, not obviously, but the one that's got the most philosophical airplay, I guess, in the last 50 years is the claim initially made by Lucas and then sort of beefed up by Penrose to the effect that Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows that the mind is not a Turing machine or doesn't have the functional architecture of a Turing machine. That argument has been debunked so many times that I'm not going to talk about it because I think it's well and truly dead. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that I think that the theorem hasn't got philosophical applications. I think it does. I think some of the most philosophically important applications of the theorem actually concern whether or not our mathematics is consistent. As Noson observed, there are very close connections between Gödel's results and the various paradoxical results. And I think that, that there's a way of articulating the connection in such a way as to show that our standard arithmetical views are actually inconsistent. My first shot of this was years ago, one of the first things I ever published, and I wouldn't put it in exactly the same way now. I think a lot has happened in the philosophical discussions of this in the last 40 years, but I do think that connection is still there, and I'm not going to go into it now, but let me just, I'm saying this because I do think the mathematical result does have important philosophical implications. So I don't think that Gödel's theorems are simply mathematical results. I do think they're philosophically profound.
Thank you so much, Graham. I'm going to turn the same question to Professor Yanofsky. How philosophical and how mathematical are these proofs?
I think they're both. I mean, well, they're definitely mathematical. And as Juliette pointed out, I mean, he in his paper, he avoids almost all philosophical things. He never mentions, as far as I don't think he mentions Hilbert's program at all in the original paper. And I don't think that he, again, as Juliette said, you know, his views changed about things. His views changed about the Hilbert program. His views changed about philosophy also. In the 40s, he was already, in the late 40s at least, he was already a firm Platonist, whatever. But I don't, you know, it seems from that quote that Juliette said that at the time of the writings, he wasn't. So I don't know if he had some deep philosophical agenda while writing the paper. Truth, the fact that truth and proof are different, that was a technical result. I'm not sure what he had in mind. There's a paper by Martin Davis says, what did Gödel believe and and when did he believe it? Which he goes through how, Gödel's thoughts did change over these things. And Axel, you asked, why did he change? That's not clear either. That's a damn good question. To say it's either one or the other, math or philosophy is hard to say. There's this cute little theorem. If you read the boys and girls, there used to be something called an encyclopedia before Wikipedia. If you read the Encyclopedia Britannica on algebraic topology, so in algebraic topology, there's this cute theorem. It says as follows. It's called the hairy ball theorem. It's got a more fancier name. Basically, if you have a ball and it has hair on it, little pieces of hair coming out, there's no way you can comb it so that so that every point moves. In other words, you can't comb it well. And of course, mathematicians go crazy over this, and they talk about what about the donut, and what about this shape, and what about that shape. Anyways, and the encyclopedia says one of the consequences of this is that you can prove at every moment there's some place on Earth where the wind is not blowing. Now, is that a math theorem or is that a meteorology theorem? Anyways, Gödel's theorem is definitely a technical math theorem, but it does have philosophical consequences. And as Graham said, different people take different things out of it philosophically, but that's okay. I think we're going to talk more about that later on, but it definitely is it definitely does have philosophical consequences. I also want to say something else. I think it's really the first major theorem in proof theory. I mean, obviously there are, Hilbert was working, Finsler was working. There were a lot of people that were working in proof theory, but this is like the first, people were setting up proof theory, but Gödel's theorem is really the first major theorem. And I think proof theory by itself has a tremendous influence on philosophy of mathematics. Just to restate, mathematics is not about a series of ideas. Mathematics is about proving ideas. And proof theory is mathematics being self-referential in the sense of, thinking about itself and thinking about it, how it works. So it's definitely, it is a philosophical thing. And just one quick thing. When Andrew Wiles proved Fermat's last theorem, everyone's first question was, can his proof be done in PA? And again, what they had in mind is Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So it is influential. It is philosophically important and things like that. Okay, sorry.
Noson, is the answer to that known yet?
I have no idea. I think I do not know that. I do not know.
I think people claim that it can be done in PA, but it's just too tedious to do it. So Colin McClarty, I think, knows the latest, but I've asked him, well, okay, it can be done, but it's too tedious to do it. Is this where mathematics is right now? Here's a theorem, it's true, but I don't have time to work out all the cases or something. I don't know. So I think there's still something very funny going on there. If it's my turn, Axel, to say, yes. I have some responses. So one thing to keep in mind, first of all, the theorem is like, it's an explosion from another planet. I mean, if you think about the prehistoric state of logic prior to 1931 or 1930, September 1930 is when Gödel announces it in Königsberg. I mean, there was no notion of a formal semantics, right? The completeness theorem, that's the odd thing. The completeness theorem is the cornerstone of model theory, but there's no explicit semantics there. It's at all. The notion of primitive recursion was known in 1928. It had emerged, but the notion, as we were saying, fixed point theorem, I mean, there was just a bare landscape. And, here comes this theorem that is just got, fixed point, primitive recursion, represent strong representability of the primitive recursive functions, unprovability of consistency. I mean, just a massive, massive, massive thing. And nowadays, the incompleteness theorem is just the beginning of, but it's a worthwhile exercise to think about, what an incredible innovation that was at the time. And I know that Noson mentioned Finsler. Finsler claimed to have had arithmetization. Zermelo didn't understand the proof at all. I recommend reading the Zermelo Gödel correspondence in the collected works. Gödel's explaining to Zermelo, look, there's the sign and then there's the referent of the sign. And these two things are different. I quoted some of that correspondence in my Elements book. As for Gödel's hesitations, one big thing we haven't mentioned so far is the fact that the adequacy problem for the recursive function. So he had this notion of recursive function, but it wasn't until 5 years later, basically until 1936, that they really understood what these functions were, and they were right to be concerned, because as we know now, and as Noson said, the theorems are very, very sensitive to, for example, notation systems. Most mathematicians use infix notation. I just found out what this meant this summer, i.e. parentheses, right? Parentheses, bracket, curly braces. That's infix notation. If you change the notation system, you can write down a formal system, which, looks fine otherwise, but the consistency statement is provable. It turns out that there's, you can, as Pfefferman famously pointed out in his, I think, 1963 paper on the meta mathematics in a general setting, right? You can change the numeration. It's extremely sensitive to the syntactic properties of these various framework aspects. You can get them to fail fairly easily. On the other hand, they also, as Graham said, they're, as a phenomenon, it's fixed points and self-reference, and so it's all over the place. So just as a kind of last comment on this go round, of course we can take piano arithmetic. Okay, it's incomplete, so we can add the consistency statement. We can keep adding those independent statements until we get to true arithmetic. What is true arithmetic? The theory consisting of all statements in the language of arithmetic that hold in the natural numbers. Well, what makes that not a satisfactory solution to incompleteness is that the provability is no longer a recursively enumerable property. So it's really computability that gives the incompleteness theorems their power, right? If it otherwise, right, we might as well just work with true arithmetic, right? So that's important. I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that is why it is also an epistemological theory, precisely because that's how we are understanding those constraints to computability.
Yeah.
Okay, we have to move toward.
Yeah, can I just say one quick story, which somebody told me this privately. A fairly famous mathematician went over to Andrew Wiles after he proved Fermat's last theorem, like a year after, and he asked him the following question. He says, "Why did it work? I'm not asking you the technical details. The technical, it's obviously true, but why did Kummer and Kronacker's method of trying to solve Fermat's last theorem, why didn't that work and your method did work?" And Andrew Wiles answered him, and again, this is not well known because, I mean, this guy never stated it. He didn't say this in public, but he said, "Oh, we're about 50 years away from understanding that." And that's just a boost for philosophy of mathematics. In other words, yeah, the technical results are there. That's fine. But, what does it philosophically mean and stuff like that? That's important. Same thing with Gödel's theorem. The technical results there, it's years to understand philosophically what it really means. Okay, sorry.
Oh, perfectly. Thank you. That's very, very, very insightful. I want then to turn to Graham to be the first to answer the next question. Because for some years, I mean, Gödel's theorem already Noson mentioned, it's been very associated to Hilbert's program, and it was taken as a knockdown argument against Hilbert's program of the foundation of mathematics. Nonetheless, at least two projects now show that Hilbert's program is not doomed, right? And one of them is the project of non-classical mathematics, in particular inconsistent mathematics, as proposed by Meyer, Rutley, Brady, Weber, and others. And the other is the more well-known project of reverse mathematics, championed by Harvey Friedman, Steve Gibson, and many, many others. What do you think about the impact of Gödel's theorems on the foundations of mathematics, especially the Hilbert-like ones, seen 90 years after?
Okay. Let me restrict myself to talk about Hilbert's program, because otherwise there's too much to say. And I don't know much about the second possibility you mentioned. I'll leave that to others to talk about. But let me talk about the implications of paraconsistency on Hilbert's program. And it's kind of complicated. So let me try and make the various issues as simple as I can, although I'll have to slide over a lot of details. Let me come back to the statement of Gödel's theorem that I gave just now, namely that every recursively enumerable or axiomatizable theory which can represent all recursive functions is either inconsistent or incomplete. All right, and nothing I want to say problematizes that. Of course, if you assume that the underlying logic is classical or any other explosive logic, then you're kind of justified in ignoring the inconsistency option, because inconsistency gives you triviality. But once you use a paraconsistent logic, then you can have inconsistency and non-triviality. And that does raise the question of whether that regenerates or resuscitates Hilbert's program. And paraconsistent logicians have been aware of this right from the 1970s, 1960s. So let me address that question. And that's where it starts to get complicated. First, Hilbert's program itself. Hilbert's program had two aspects. The first is that you can axiomatize mathematics. And the second is that you can prove your axiom system consistent. In fact, it's got to be more than just prove it consistent, because if the theory is trivial, you can prove everything. In particular, you can prove the theory is consistent. So the proof procedures have got to be secure in some sense. So Hilbert insisted they have to be finite free. Whatever that means, we don't need to go into that now. But there are these two prongs of the program. First, axiomatize, then prove finite free consistency. And paraconsistency bears on both of those things. Let's take the first of these. Hilbert had already axiomatized Euclidean geometry. So the next major theory was to axiomatize was arithmetic. So a lot of the discussion in the 1920s concerns the axiomatizability of arithmetic. Of course, geometry and arithmetic are not all of mathematics, but let's just stick to arithmetic for a moment. Now, Gödel's result does not show that you can't have a complete theory. It shows you can't have a complete consistent theory. And what we now know is that there are arithmetics which use an underlying power-consistent logic, which are complete. You can prove for any p, either p or not p. In fact, you can prove everything that's true in the standard model of arithmetic. Of course, you can prove a lot more because the theories are inconsistent, but you can characterize for various systems the way in which where the inconsistencies are located. For example, they might be located only for numbers after 10 to the 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 whatever. Okay. So certainly you can get inconsistent theories which are complete. Now, that's really only a start of the issue because Hilbert's program was to not just axiomatize arithmetic, but to axiomatize all mathematics. Now, that's a much bigger challenge, okay? I don't think that challenge can be met by anyone's standards. If you just stick your classical hat on for a moment, then you're going to say, well, the overarching mathematical theory is something like Zumilo-Fraenkel set theory, or at least we have this structure which is the cumulative hierarchy. Can you axiomatize that? And I think there are real problems about that which are completely independent of Gödel's theorem. We don't really understand the width of the hierarchy, we don't really understand the length of the hierarchy, and so on. So what an axiomatization of a complete axiomatization of set theory would like is just completely unclear. And adding in paraconsistency just makes matters more complicated, because at least, you know, wearing a classical hat, you know what the kind of canonical interpretation of set theory is like. Once you move to a paraconsistent framework, there are still debates about how you best formulate a paraconsistent set theory with the comprehension principle. Those are issues that have been under investigation now for 20, 30, 40 years. And we know various ways you can proceed, but there's still no clearly best way to answer that question. Now, we can go into the details, but I don't think I'll do it here because they're just going to take us off at a tangent. Okay, so I only dealt so far with the first aspect of Hilbert's program, axiomatization. Second aspect is proving consistency. All right. Now, once you move to a paraconsistent framework, you're dealing with inconsistent theories, so it will be silly to expect to have a proof of consistency. However, there's something very closely related, in fact, which is classically equivalent, which you can ask about, namely triviality. Can you prove everything? So if you have some of these inconsistent theories, such as inconsistent arithmetics, such as inconsistent set theories, can you prove non-triviality? And more importantly, can you prove it in a finite tree fashion? And the answer to that is yes. And that goes back to some old work by Bob Meyer in the 1970s, where Bob established that for certain axiomatic theories of arithmetic and set theory, you can have finite tree non-triviality results, which are representable in the theories themselves. Of course, once you're dealing with an inconsistent theory, there's always more to the issue, because can you can prove non-triviality in a finite tree fashion, but could you also possibly prove triviality as well? Okay, that's an issue that has to be faced. What would such a thing be like? Would it be finite tree? Okay, there are lots of interesting issues there. And again, this is not the place to go into the technical details, but let me just say that if you're working in an appropriate para-consistent context, you can prove non-triviality by finite tree means, for at least some theories.
Thank you so much, Graham. Now I turn the question to Noson. What is the relation right now between Gödel's incompleteness and foundational projects like Hilbert's?
There's nothing more to add to what Graham said. And also, just again, Gödel's original feelings about Hilbert's program changes over time. I just want to emphasize something that Graham said. He said, if you have an inconsistent system, then it can prove its consistency. So it's not even clear what consistency means. You know, if you can prove consistency, what does that mean? You know, you wouldn't go over to someone and say, you know, lend me $100. I'll give it back to you, and and the guy will say, "How do you know I'll give it back to you?" And you say, "I'm telling you. I personally will tell you." In other words, self-consistency is not really worth anything. You know, a person telling their own, you know, consistency is somewhat less worthwhile. Again, you know, I don't know about the modern versions, you know, Harvey Friedman and those other things that you mentioned, but what Hilbert wanted was very, as Graham said, it's a challenge that I don't think anybody can meet. So that's. You know, people say Gödel put an end to Hilbert's program, but it's not clear that Hilbert's program was ever going to be met by anybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Juliette, would you like to add also something to this issue?
Yeah, I think, so Gödel himself was very careful. I think there's a footnote in the 31 paper, or the 34 lectures were published much later, where he said, look, this in no way contradicts the finitary point of view, Hilbert's point of view, because there might be finitary proofs which are not formalizable in my system. And then after a few years, and you can't overemphasize the role of Turing enough here, he reverses himself on that issue. And how he reverses himself is so that if you think about it, one of the sort of sore spots is the notion of a formal system. So for Gödel, that did not fall into place until after Turing's work. And then he will say things like a formal system is a mechanical, you know, it's a machine. He uses even this machine language, not machine language, but the language of machines to, you know, talk about this. A formal system is nothing but a machine for producing theorems. And then he talks about how this settled so many philosophical issues for him. I mean, Church's thesis and so many other things. So in terms of Gödel's old, and then as time went on, I mean, if you go, there's the correspondence volumes 4 and 5 in the collected works. But if you go to Firestone, which I encourage everyone to do if you're ever in the Princeton area, there are many, many more letters that people wrote to Gödel asking, what is the meaning of the incompleteness theorems? And he would answer. And he would say things like, my theorems show that mathematics, one of the things he was given to say is mathematics cannot be mechanized, right? He would, that was a kind of stock answer that he gave. Well, okay, now here we are in 2021. Maybe it can't be mechanized. In fact, I had I was giving a talk at the Institute one day, and Vladimir Voevodsky was in the audience, and I quoted Gödel on that. So that was a very ironic moment, because you can mechanize huge pieces of it, right? What Gödel's theorems show is that you can't do the whole thing in one go, right? Because there are going to be things that will fall out. But even then, you might say, well, but these are sort of artifactual or residual incompleteness is what people sometimes call it. As far as the Hilbert program, I agree completely with Noson that it was extremely radical program. I mean, now Hilbert said different things at different times. So he's, it's when you talk about the Hilbert program, there's no single, report of it that you can really rely on. But I mean, this idea that, as thinking classically, that there should be an internal consistency proof, a finitary consistency proof, and of course the demand for completeness, right? So this is just now Hilbert formulated the program, so he says, and other people at the time would say, and there was the Frege inconsistency, the very first attempt, to codify, to come up with a codification of this part of mathematics fails. Then we have Cantor inventing, all these infinite, inventing the transfinite. So there was a feeling of crisis. Now Kreisel says, well, that was all just propaganda for the program. There was no crisis and nobody was worried about consistency, and so on and so forth. That's just public relations on Hilbert's part, which he was very, very good at. So, but if you take that seriously, if you take the program seriously and its sort of philosophical roots, then yeah, Gödel's program pretty much demolishes those aspirations. On the other hand, proof theory is just a marvelous thing. I mean, so what Turing improved by Pfefferman shortly after, in the early 60s, in the paper I mentioned, actually, that if you iterate consistency statements over piano arithmetic at level omega plus 1, you get pi 1 completeness. So you can prove all the true pi 1 statements, right? And that was, I guess the way you would say that is that, you can extract a proof theoretic ordinal for that consistency statement. I'm not a proof theorist, so probably I have the lingo wrong. But anyway, then there's the larger question, the mathematicians just picked up and went on without taking notice of the theorem, pretty much, right? I mean, if you talk to number theorists, right, people who work on Diophantine equations, here the incompleteness theorems are telling you, they're giving you information about solutions of Diophantine equations that, there's some independence there in terms of ordinary finitary Diophantine equations. And I think some of the number theorists are worried, is this going to, is this a kind of ticking time bomb that's going to explode on them, or will they just be able to avoid all this? Who knows? Anything can happen. I went on maybe a bit too long, but that's my answer.
No, thank you so much, Juliette. So then I'm going to ask for the next question. Maybe why don't we start with Noson? We already started one question with Graham, one with Juliette. So let me ask Noson, A simple question. What do you think is the most misunderstood or underappreciated aspect of Gödel's incompleteness theorem and the surrounding debate?
I want to talk about, rather than misunderstood, I want to talk about, to me, the hardest part of Gödel's incompleteness theorem is the diagonalization part, where, like Juliette said, even Gödel did it on the fly. He did it because he's a super genius, whatever. But you needed Carnap to understand what was going on with that diagonalization. I have a friend who has a great line. He said, that part of Gödel's incompleteness theorem you can't prove without notes. In other words, when you get to that, when you teach it in class, you got to get into. It just doesn't flow. You got to see what's going on. So, to me, that's I don't think it's underappreciated. I think it's hard to understand. That's it. That's all I want to say. That's the very hard part, and I'm trying to understand it. Every time I do it, I try to get it closer and closer to it, but it's hard to understand. Anyways, that's it.
Thank you so much, Graham. What do you think is the most misunderstood and underappreciated aspect of it all?
Okay, misunderstood and underappreciated are different things. Okay,
yes.
Look. Gödel's theorem is widely misunderstood, not by mathematicians, but by philosophers. And when I read philosophers who kind of cavalierly appeal to Gödel's theorem, it's absolutely clear that they do not understand it. Okay, I'm not going to mention names. You can fill in the details for yourself. So there are very wide misunderstandings of the theorem by philosophers. Not all philosophers. Some understand it very well. Many don't. Okay. Underappreciated is more interesting, I think. Look, this is something of a hobby horse, but let me ride it anyway. Come back to this statement of the theorem as I made it. It's a proof of a disjunction. This theory is either incomplete or inconsistent. Now, what I think is underappreciated is the fact that there's the second disjunct there. So many people, philosophers and mathematicians, when I hear them state Gödel's incompleteness theorem, just say, oh, it proves that such and such is incomplete. It does not. It proves that it's either incomplete or inconsistent. Now, if you'd identify inconsistency with triviality, you've got a very good reason to ignore the inconsistency limit. But we now know better. It doesn't have to be like that, because you can have controlled inconsistency. Now, it may well be that you think that nonetheless one should reject controlled inconsistency. That's an issue. That's an important issue. But it's not one you can ignore. So what I would like to see amongst mathematicians and philosophers is the realization that Gödel's theorem proves a disjunction. And if you want to reject one of the disjuncts, well, you better have some very good arguments, or at least consider it and not just ignore it or not even be aware of it.
Okay, so from now on, I'm no longer going to call it the Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I'm going to call it the Gödel's incompleteness or inconsistency theorem. I think that would be fair, right?
Good on you, Axel. Good on you.
No, I'm serious. Okay, so here, our next question. Provokingly, now that we're talking about
okay, I don't think Juliette's had a turn to answer this question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. I am sorry so much. Please.
Yeah, well, I think the theorems are, I sometimes enjoy, in a kind of perverse way, reading people like Régis Debray and others who talk about, that it shows the inconsistency of self-government. People really take it and run with it. So I don't know if those are misunderstandings or not. I tend to approve of that kind of creativity. It's not science, but it's very creative. As far as the underappreciated part, and again, thinking classically, I really wonder about, the idea that the incompleteness, the statement is a Diophantine equation and not some crazy non-standard thing. I mean, it's with standard coefficients. And so, when you talk to number theorists about this, first of all, they don't even know that. And it's interesting, this was von Neumann asked Gödel at the famous meeting in September 1930, Königsberg, can you put this statement in Diophantine form? Is it arithmetic? I'm using, there's a story there about, the MRDP theorem and so on. But anyway, he asked Gödel if it can be put into, if it can be expressed in first order arithmetic, and Gödel does that actually in the paper. Anyway, these are Diophantine equations. Now you say to number theorists, aren't you worried about this? And they say, well, there's all this coding, right? You have this coding, you get one undecidable sentence, you get, you have another coding, you have another undecidable. But something I was talking with Menachem Magador about this, and he said, but all these codings are recursive in each other, right? So there is a sort of unified phenomenon there that may one day emerge in the form that some of what the number theorists want to do is these are going to turn out to be independent. Maybe not. I mean, they seem very confident when you talk to them that they're in the sort of territory where everything is decidable. That's what they think. So I would say, people should really, I mean, the number theorists are doing what they do and they shouldn't be deflected from it, but they should be aware of the fact that the incompleteness theorems are telling us something about solutions of Diophantine equations.
Thank you so much, Juliette. And again, I'm sorry for having...
No worries.
Okay, so then I'm going to go back then to the alphabetic order and start with you on the last question. Provokingly, Laubert, I don't know how to pronounce the last name, once questioned that Gödel's incompleteness or inconsistency theorem was often declared to be the most significant result of the 20th century, which he viewed, like many other limitation theorems, such as Tarski's or Turing's, as an instance of Cantor's theorem, and that, and I quote, such extra mathematical publicity movements concealed an agenda for reestablishing belief as a substitute for science. How do you see the connections between the theorem and other limitations results? Do you think it is used for agendas like that mentioned by Laubert?
Laubert is such a fascinating personality. So I mean, the fixed point theorem is equivalent to Tarski's theorem on the undefinability of truth, right? Robinson points this out, I think, in the 50s. The undecidability of the halting problem can be used to prove Gödel's theorem. So all of these, and I'd be fascinated, Noson, to read this paper of Lavier, I guess it was, that you were saying, that ties all these things together in a more formal way. But certainly we know already that, these are all, more or less the same kind of result. As far as agendas, I think the philosophers, when they, the agenda, for example, people who work on truth, they want very much to have a non-paradoxical truth predicate. It's a huge, huge industry. And I mean, I don't see why we can't. Stanley, who Noson used to know, used to always be mystified by this. And he used to say, when we talk about a field, we just say, everything has a divisor except zero. You can't divide by zero. Why make a big deal out of it? And say we want a non-paradoxical, with respect to zero theory. So I don't know, about various agendas. I'm very critical of many agendas in philosophy today. I think things have become over-rationalized, and in a sense, maybe Gödel's theorems contributed to that in kind of pushing formal systems into philosophical territory, so that everybody now can, come up with their own formal system in order to, prove this or that. We've sort of gotten away from a way of doing philosophy that's not hyper rationalized in that way. So,
but can I pressure you a little bit more on this other positive option? So, what would be this other way of doing philosophy that is not over rationalizing?
Well, I think just doing this very hard thing in the world we live in, introspection, asking yourself, you're sitting in a philosophy lecture and there's a very famous person there, throwing out all kinds of things. Quine, telling us that 2 + 2 = 4 is revisable, and so on. Now, that was part of a very, very principled point of view, holism from Duhem, actually. But, I think we've there's so much pressure on philosophers now, especially young philosophers, that you don't really see people thinking deeply. So, I mean, that's kind of a non-answer, but I think philosophy has become now, as soon as you think of a question, you write down the set of axioms, right? And then you have to specify a language, and then you say, oh, well, are these axioms complete, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why not just live with the question a little bit longer? Another positive branch, the ordinary language philosophers, which has sort of revived now. I think they're writing absolutely beautiful papers, one after the other these days.
I agree.
Who do you have in mind, Juliette? Who are the contemporary ordinary language philosophers?
Sandra Logier. I think maybe Cora Diamond can be considered in that. Avner Baz wrote a book from Tufts, Why We Need Ordinary Language Philosophy. I think it's sort of grown out of a certain kind of feminist critique of a priori philosophizing. They talk about the kind of addiction to generality, and the idea being we should sort of pull back and reflect on our language. I mean, I think the Wittgensteinians can be more or less folded into that category.
No, I was just curious as to know who you had in mind.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Can I just add to Juliette about over technolize or over mathematizing philosophy? You can't. It's hard. I'm saying many Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy articles. They bring in the things, and there's a mathematical formalism to explain this and this and this, and it just it's not, like you said, let them just think about it. Why mathematize philosophy? But they're particularly a lot of the articles there. I mean, first of all, it's an excellent source. I'm not denying it, but there's always a section. Let's give you axioms and put it into mathematical and set theoretic terms.
Right, and if I may just say, Gödel himself, right? I mean, his papers are beautifully written in ordinary language, and in a way, there's a political issue also, because he wasn't using the jargon of, analytic philosophy of his time. And, people who don't use that jargon, you are in a position to be marginalized, you know. So I think I think we're living in a very, very difficult time for young philosophers, and, you know, slowing down is just not, you know, not something you see people doing, but I hope you do. But I just mean to say Gödel's own philosophy was certainly not hyper rationalized, right? He talked about truth, he talked about existence in very plain spoken ways. He didn't he didn't get involved in the discussion of meaning, right? He uses meaning as a primitive. So truth, meaning, reference, all of these had their common sense meanings for Gödel. He didn't see them as something to theorize about. Do I need a theory of meaning in order to justify the existence of large cardinals? No.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right. Can I ask you now, Professor Priest, also to tackle this question?
Okay. I'm tempted to comment on the state of contemporary philosophy. Yes. I'm going to resist that.
No!
Well, look, let me just say that that philosophy is not a uniform thing. If you go to different places, you'll find it's done in different ways. People take different things for granted. The way that philosophy is done in New York is not the same way that it's done in Berlin. It's not the same way it's done in Buenos Aires, not the same way as it's done in Kyoto. And so I would kind of resist making sweeping generalizations about the state of philosophy in the world today. Now, the state of philosophy in each of those places, that's a different matter. And as I say, I'm not going to resist the temptation to go into that any further. Okay, but let's just return to your question, which is the connection between Gödel's theorem and the limitative results. Okay, that's kind of a hard question. Look, there are some very clear and very precise connections. So, as Juliette said, you can prove the halting. You can use the halting theorem to prove the first incompleteness theorem. You can use the first incompleteness theorem to prove the undecidability of second-order logic. Okay, those are tight connections. But question: is there a more general connection between all these things? And what suggests there might be is that there do seem to be structural features which seem to keep recurring, all right? So it would be jolly nice if there were such a thing. I've never found one to my satisfaction. I don't think it's the case that all the incomplete results are saying the same thing, but they're not. Do they all fit into a common framework? Well, Noson mentioned the Lovere results, and I don't know very well, so I'll let him comment on that. But I believe him when he says it doesn't really do what's required, and I don't know of any other thing that does exactly what is required. So at the moment, it seems to me that the connections are more of a kind of Wittgensteinian family resemblance than something you can put into a precise mathematical formula, as it were. Now, one of the things that complicates matters, and I'll just note this and then shut up, is that the kind of structural similarities that we note in the proofs of the halting theorem, Gödel's theorem, and so on, are present in paradoxical results too, like the liar paradox and the paradox of set theory. Now, provided you articulate the property, there's nothing wrong with the limitative results. There is something wrong with some of the paradoxes. Some of them maybe you can accept, some of them you certainly can't. So if you have some kind of common structure, it would seem that it applies to things which are acceptable and things which aren't acceptable. And how do you draw that distinction? Again, I have no idea. It's a really interesting question. It would be lovely if there was a good answer to it, but I don't know one.
Thank you so much, Graham. I'm going to pass the question to Noson.
Hi. So this is something I can talk about, but I just want to start off by the first word in your question, provokingly. Levere once questioned the GIT. Levere is an extremely, extremely intelligent man and an extremely serious man, whatever. It might be provoking. In other words, when people read it, they're upset about it, but he did not do it to be provokingly. In other words, he meant it as a very serious thing. What he was talking about was what we have been talking about over the past hour about how people misuse Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And he says, don't misuse it. And he has a result which shows how it can be formalized, so it's not. Now, so anyways, so first of all, let me just say, Levere didn't mean it to be provoking. So anyways, so first of all, let me just say,
Hola, les notifico que a las 11, nada más ahorita vamos a hacer el switch o el cambio Abel y yo de la transmisión, pero a las 11 tendremos la sesión de discusión sobre esta grabación que están viendo. Esta grabación se hizo hace varias semanas en el marco del taller de Didáctica de la Lógica. Se hizo esta mesa redonda con el profesor Priest, Yanofsky y Kennedy. Ahora bien, a las 11 tendremos la sesión de discusión, moderará el doctor Axel Barceló. Entonces, se les hizo llegar por correo los datos de acceso. Yo voy a continuar transmitiendo esta mesa, pero por cualquier cosa, en el momento de hacer el cambio a la siguiente sesión, se perdiera esta, bueno, ustedes ya saben que nos deben encontrar en la otra, donde tendremos la sesión de discusión, porque si no mal recuerdo, quizás Zoom, cuando inicie la otra sesión, se va a cerrar esta. Pero puede que sí, puede que no, previniendo eso.
No, de hecho sí se tiene que cerrar y tiene que abrir la otra.
Exacto. Entonces vamos a parar aquí la transmisión. Déjenme ponerles en el chat el
No,
link.
pero vas a continuar tú, ¿no? Ahorita puedes continuar.
No, pero,
los últimos minutos.
pero tú te vas a ir y vas a abrir la otra.
Sí, pero ahorita espero. Ok, si se pierde esta, volver a esta. ¿A eso te refieres?
Más bien, ajá, o sea, si tú te sales, o sea, yo ya quedo como el hospedador y ya está.
Sí, yo
Pero
espero que
si tú abres la que sigue, que es la de esa la abriste con los datos de Larisa, ¿verdad?
No, exacto, voy a abrirla con otra.
Perfecto, entonces no se pierde esta.
Sí, no, para nada.
Perfecto. Ok,
Vale,
entonces nada más era ese aviso. Se les hizo llegar por correo los datos. De todos modos, ahorita yo se los pongo aquí en el chat, los datos para la sesión de discusión. Y afortunadamente tendrá esa traducción simultánea al español, aunque nos comentan algunos seguidores que igual la traducción no es del todo buena, la que hace Zoom. Hay algunos problemillas ahí con la traducción simultánea. Igual lo estuve checando y sí, una que otra cosa se pierde, pero si tuvieran preguntas qué hacerle a los profesores y no se animan a formularle en inglés, nosotros podemos ayudarlos. Podemos ayudar a formular.
Te pueden intentar con el traductor, o sea, no es tan mala, yo creo, pero bueno, pues chequemos.
Sí, vale, muy bien. Entonces, eso, vamos a hacer el cambio. Yo empezaré a transmitir donde nos quedamos de esta mesa.
Gracias.
¿En mi pantalla?
El sonido no se oye.
it's not. Now, so anyways, so first of all, let me just say, Levere didn't mean it to be provoking. He meant it to be taken seriously. And he's arguing against something that we've all been talking about for the past hour, namely, don't use Gödel's theorem for something else. So he says belief rather than science. I want to just one correction. Graham, the Levere's does include Gödel and the liar and whatever, and all these different things. There are some other.
I know that, Noson.
Right. And he's very clear with it, and it's very exact. So But what I was talking about earlier was, there are other types of results that are not they're seemingly fixed point results, like Knast or Tarski fixed point results, which doesn't fit into Levier's thing, but that's fine.
That's what I was referring to. But
right.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I know he fits in some of the paradoxes into the result too. But as far as I understand the results, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, there's nothing to explain the difference between the good instances of this structure and the bad instances.
Maybe self-reference. In other words, Knast-Tarski is definitely, or Brouwer fixed point, there's no self-reference there. Everything else pretty much has self-reference. I don't know.
There's self-reference in the Gödel results, and that's a fine result.
Right. So what do you mean? What do you mean by bad results?
Well, you can prove paradoxes, and you can prove bona fide theorems. Now, of course, some people like me think you can accept some of the paradoxical results. But even people like me think you can't accept all of them, like the result of the Curry paradox, for example. So there's a question of, you've got this structure, lots of things fit into it. Some of the things that fit into it deliver acceptable conclusions, some don't. And I was just saying that as far as I understand the Levire structure, which is not very well, I don't think there's anything which distinguishes between these two things, is there?
Okay, so Levier's theorem, what it does is you don't want to accept Curry's paradox. And let me not answer your question. Let me just say what Levire was talking about when he was being provoking. He said, "Look,
Noson, if I may." What does he mean by we're talking about belief? I didn't understand that at all.
Right. So the way I understand it, what he was arguing about was he set up a formalism. You have an object in a category, think of it as a set, and you have some function between these objects. And what he does is he gets a result about representing some function with other functions. I can be formal, but and he does, let's say, the Barber paradox in this terms. Now, the result is that the Barber or the element of the set represented by the Barber is not within this collection; it's within another collection, which is a very exact thing. What Levire is pushing against is he didn't like, the usual resolution of the Barber paradox is the village does not exist. Okay, he wouldn't talk about existence or non-existence, or the heterological Grelling's paradox. Oh, this word does not exist, or what was talked about before. You're not allowed to divide by zero. Or even, the set theoretic paradoxes. There's a class versus, sets are okay, classes are not okay. That's not something he wanted to get into. He feels it would be bad to get into. That's one thing those are certain things that he's really talking about. And so he gives a formal, exact thing of what all these different instances of self-referential paradox can be stated in nice mathematical functions going from here to there language without getting into any metaphysics of this word doesn't exist, this village doesn't exist. You're not allowed to divide by zero because you're going to get a contradiction. That's one thing he's talking against. The other thing he's talking against is simply in the popular culture, Gödel's theorem is used in irrational ways. It's been mentioned here before, and I've read it. It's been in theology and in voting things. It's been mentioned in theology papers and in voting things. And Levire is against using it, against that. And he's saying these results are not Gödel's result is not saying anything metaphysical like that, and it can be stated in a very nice, normal language.
Noson,
Please.
if I can just interrupt you, I mean, Smolyan's proof, have you seen Smolyan's completely abstract, logic-free, language-free, I think it's from 56 or some, or maybe a little bit later. It's astonishing. It's totally abstract. So I don't know what Levere did, but what you're describing sounds exactly like what Smolyan did.
I'll say even more. It sounds exactly like Gödel did. I mean, Gödel didn't invoke any. Gödel's result is an extremely technical, non-philosophical, result with an exact. You can't find any errors in that paper. Small errors, whatever. So
a little bit of sloppiness. Yeah.
Right, but so he's. What I think Levere's talking against is what Torkel Frenzen's talking against, in his book, Gödel's Theorem, an Incomplete Guide to Its Use and Abuse. Postmodernists are using Gödel's theorem for this, and again, theologians are using Gödel's theorems for that, et cetera, et cetera. So, 1 second. Let me just finish off with one last thing. I do disagree. I do think it's one of the most important theorems of the 20th century, if not more. I do think. I'm not sure what Levere would say it's not, but I do think it's the founding of proof theory, and it's the founding of mathematics being self-referential, and it's the founding of mathematics being a lot deeper than it was. And I think so yes. Okay, sorry.
Or as deep as it ever was, right?
Right.
I mean, von Neumann made this remark that if Hilbert's program had succeeded, mathematicians would have been replaced by machines. And Gödel's theorem shows that. Now, that's not very feasible, probably, but even in principle, the mathematician cannot be replaced by the machine. So in a sense, it does great honor to the subject, and it says, there's a lot more here than meets the eye, and you cannot mechanize this practice.
Thank you so much for all of you. These were our questions. Do you have any final concluding remarks that you want to share with us before we say goodbye?
I would just like to say, I wanted to, just on this last thing, about how Gödel's theorem is abused. It's abused in two different ways. If you look at these things, it's abused in two different ways. One way is people say, oh, look, mathematics also has its beliefs rather than its truths. Okay. And I'm thinking of Klein's book, The Loss of Certainty. Mathematics is somehow also broken and based essentially on the deepest level. You just have to accept it and do it. That's one way it's abused. And another way in which it's abused is that people say, oh, look, this is just like Gödel's theorem. Gödel's theorem says that every system needs some metaphysics theorem or something like that. I accept Gödel's theorem, and I'm looking, I'm saying, okay, we have to go beyond. Now, those two things are related, but in some sense they're opposing each other. In other words, the first one is pointing to a weakness of mathematics or logic by Gödel's theorem, and the second one is saying, look, math is perfect. It's the paragon of reason. Spinoza and everyone else is trying to be, and Wittgenstein are trying to be mathematical. And I am also, an abuser of Gödel's incompleteness theorem would say, I am also being like mathematics, and Gödel's incompleteness theorem says you have to go beyond the system in some sense. So they're both using Gödel's incompleteness theorem, but one is a weakness and one is a strength in opposing senses. Anyways, it is a fascinating topic.
I agree. Anybody else would like to add any concluding remarks?
Yeah, I would just like to say that, in the research that I did for this Elements book on the incompleteness theorem, I had to get on top of what people are doing now. There are diagonal free proofs, there are logic free proofs, there are language free proofs. I mean, it's incredible how the subject is advanced and how much is known about those theorems now. On the other hand, it's kind of shocking that, for example, you change the notation system and you get provability of G2, right? This is a 1-year-old result. So, there's this feeling, my feeling is we're really at the beginning of understanding what this means. I mean, certainly we know that our very first attempt to write down axioms for arithmetic. I mean, first of all, the fact that there are two continually many non-isomorphic countable models of arithmetic. That's almost more shocking than the incompleteness theorems. I mean, how could it be that we write down these blindingly obvious axioms? They certainly should describe uniquely the natural numbers. Oh, even just the countable models, forget the uncountable ones that you get from Lowenheim's poem. There are as many as possible, continually many. So we're being sort of assaulted on all sides every time we try to, grasp onto something definite and concrete. We have these results if we stick to the first order formulations of these theorems. If we go to higher order, we have other problems. We get proof predicates that are not RE, and we get categoricity, but we lose our nice proof predicates. So it's kind of this beautiful picture of lack of safety and uncertainty and things just constantly slipping through our hands. And I think that's a very beautiful situation to be in. I mean, that's what von Neumann, I think, meant. Do we really want everything to be decidable, all our theories to be complete, everything to be categorical? Wouldn't that be boring? So this has plunged us into a very, very beautiful situation. And whatever you can say about those theorems, they've probably stimulated more philosophical reflection than just about any other you can think of. And just for that reason alone, whatever the nature of that reflection is, good or bad, what theorem in mathematics has got Régis Debray talking about the logical consistency of self-government, So
if I may add my 2 cents of how I would paraphrase that, is that mathematics didn't end up being as we had idealized it to be, but it is more beautiful the way it actually is.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the morals. So thank you so much. Do you want to add something final, Graham?
No, I've got nothing really to add to what I've already said, except to observe that mathematics is not finished indeed. It's evolved enormously over the last 4,000 years. What it's going to be like in 4,000 years, if indeed there's a human race in 4,000 years, or even 40 years, we'll just have to wait and see.
Indeed. Thank you so much. I learned so much today. Thank you so much for your participation.
And Axel, maybe you can explain that there was a problem because my name is not Yoko Vannanen. That's my husband's name.
Yes.
I didn't give up my name when I married him.
Okay, I can solve this even though it is a little late. I am very sorry that I did this.
No, it's my fault completely. I have to write to Zoom and see what the problem is, but
okay, yes, Juliette Kennedy. Yes. Now your name is correct.
Ah, okay, good.
Yeah, that means I could have corrected before I.
No worries. No
Sorry.
worries.
Okay, well,
Okay.
thanks so much.
Wonderful to see you. And I hope to be in Mexico soon, within the year. And so let's sit down over a cup of coffee and meet face to face.
Yes, it would have been great to have you all in
Yeah.
person. It was also very great to have you here. And thank you, por supuesto, a la Academia Mexicana de Lógica. Nos retiramos. Muchas gracias.
Okay. Well, just before you go, just briefly, thank you again for your participation here. And also, I was telling that at the beginning that we are going to have another more open discussion session. So what I'm thinking about that is obviously persons that have been here can send to us some questions. And also this is going to be translated soon. So there will be to a wider audience in Spanish, hopefully. So we are expecting to receive many questions. Maybe we can filter some of those questions and send them to you before the session that will be the 11th of November at 11 Mexico City time. Because our time is changing, well, we need to see how it's going to affect that for you. I'm not really sure. But just to be sure that it's going to be 11 o'clock Mexico City time, the 11th of November. 11, so it's easy to remember for all. And again, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Axel. And also, I would like to acknowledge Luis Estrada, because he was the organizer of the session. He's, I think, already here. And I don't know if you want to say something, Luis, briefly before we go. Here, he is there.
Yeah, yes, I'm here. No, I just want to thank you all for joining us in this roundtable. It was really fun. I'm sorry for being late. No, yes, thank you. It was wonderful.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for the persons that connected here and in Facebook as well. And well, looking forward to meet you again in the 11th of November. Thank you all.
Okay,
Again,
thank you.
Noson
Take
wants
care.
yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Ok, pues sería todo por esta retransmisión. Nos vemos en los otros, en la otra sesión. Ya les pasé en el chat los datos de acceso y pues hay que apurarnos para movernos de manera oportuna a esa sesión. Aquí paramos la transmisión, las transmisiones a las redes sociales. Hasta luego.